This next session is on sustainability and geopolitics. And to get into that, we have with us Heng Dean Law, who is Managing Director of Pollination, which is a climate change investment and advisory firm here in Singapore. He has a long history in Singapore. He'll be speaking to energy and sustainability, also trade and geopolitics. He has in the past focused extensively on carbon markets and decarbonization. And so feel free to, as he goes throughout his presentation, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask any questions. We don't have to wait till the end. And with that, please join me in welcoming Heng Dean Law.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anne. Okay, thanks to Heinrich for inviting me. I know it's after lunch, so I think to keep this interactive, I have a few slides, but to keep things moving along, feel free to interrupt me along the way. So, as Anne mentioned, I'm going to talk about sustainability, geopolitics, where they intersect, what the issues are, so on and so forth. I chose to use energy to illustrate some of these trends, but we need not talk about energy. We can talk about other things you have on your mind, and we can keep this interactive as much as possible. So, just by way of personal introduction, I started my career in diplomacy with the Singapore Foreign Service. Spent 9 years with the Singapore Foreign Service, where pretty much I only covered one country, which was Indonesia. And I was based at our embassy in Jakarta for 5 years. Then after that, I moved to a company called Temasek. So Temasek is an investment company owned by the Singapore government, but operated very much on commercial lines. They invest all over the world. I spent 11 years there, where I, amongst other things, did sustainability. I helped set up a wholly owned entity called Gen Zero that invests into decarbonization as well as carbon markets. Left Temasek 2 years ago, was doing a couple of things in between, and then ended up with Pollination last year. So maybe just to quickly start off, Pollination. As Anne mentioned, I think we very much focus on climate as well as nature. We do two things mainly. One is advisory, which is consulting. The other thing that we do is investments and project development. So we're not a pure play consultant like a McKinsey or a Bain, but we're not a pure play investor as well. We do a bit of both because we feel that there's synergies between the two. The main areas of focus revolves around climate and nature. So carbon markets is one key area of focus, but we also look at decarbonization, we look at nature, we look at blended finance. So we advise companies as well as countries in Asia and elsewhere on basically strategies, how to get there, what are the issues, how much do you need, what are the returns. We started quite recently in 2019. When we started, we have offices in Australia, UK, US. In September last year, we set up an office here in Singapore, basically trying to see whether we can take advantage of the opportunities in Asia in September last year. And this is where I joined the company to help set up the office. And our focus is very much on Asia. ANZ Bank, which is one of the largest banks in APAC, is a shareholder of ours. So this gives you a bit of a snapshot. And we also have a joint venture with HSBC, where we have raised close to $1 billion to invest into nature. Out of that $1 billion, there's a $200 commitment from Apple. So maybe just moving on. Yeah, so energy transition in Asia. So it's quite a hot topic, not just in Singapore, but elsewhere within Southeast Asia, as well as in India, North Asia, China, Japan, Korea. Now, the current situation is, I think as this slide shows, we are still very much dominated by fossil fuels. This is the current snapshot. Singapore is a good illustration. If you look at the most right-hand side, we're almost 100%, almost, I mean, not 100%, but almost there, getting our energy from natural gas. So primarily through two ways. One is through pipe natural gas. We get it from Indonesia, and we get it from Malaysia. And then we also get a bit from liquefied natural gas. So we have one terminal somewhere there, and there are plans to build another terminal further along. But this is not going to be, hopefully, not going to be the state in the decades to come. Singapore knows that we need to decarbonize. So we have actually put out long-term plans. So the first immediate thing is to import renewable electricity from our neighbors. The other thing that we are exploring is further afield, things like green hydrogen. So basically, the challenge with energy transition is that the places where renewables like solar and wind are abundant is not where the demand is. So in the case of Singapore, we actually are surrounded by abundant resources of renewable energy. So in the case of Australia, for instance, there's a lot of solar there. But the problem is, how do we get the electrons from Australia to Singapore? Therein lies the challenge. Some people have come out, okay, why don't we lay a 3,000-kilometer cable from Australia all the way to Singapore? And that's something that's being seriously studied right now. The other way is you convert that into green hydrogen and then you ship it to Singapore. But hydrogen is quite a difficult medium to transport. So people are thinking about converting that to ammonia. But the challenge that we are facing is, how do we get access to these kind of abundant renewable energy sources? So, but the current situation we are facing now is that the grids in Asia are predominantly fossil fuels. That means it could be coal, it could be natural gas, and to probably a lesser extent, oil as well. So with that in mind, companies, countries, they see the opportunity. So this has actually illustrates basically what people are investing into. Now, the probably the top two countries are Vietnam and Philippines. I think a few days ago, Bloomberg came out with an article about Philippines in particular, and basically highlighting the leading role it has played. So I think, if I recall correctly, I think the Bloomberg article mentioned that they have enough capacity to basically more than double their existing grid capacity. So, but a lot of these are in the works, so they're not fully executed yet. So key challenges like grid transmissions. So you need to configure the grid for renewables because of intermittency. Yeah, because the wind is not going to blow all the time. And in the case of solar, there's a small issue of nighttime when the sun doesn't shine. So all these things need to be considered. But point being, this slide basically shows that people see this as an opportunity. The other one that is not really here is actually Laos. Yeah, so Laos, people like EDF, which is a French company, are developing significant hydroelectric dams in Laos for export to its neighboring countries. So opportunities are there, but as I'll show in subsequent slides, there are issues that need to be addressed because renewable energy is not abundant all over Southeast Asia. And that's something that needs to be addressed. And this slide basically shows, is a good example of that. So wind has been talked about in other markets, but in Southeast Asia, this is actually from the US government. So basically the darker areas, more wind. Lighter areas, not much wind. So the long and short of it is that around the equator, there's not much wind. The darker areas, as you can see, in the case of Southeast Asia, is more Vietnam, Philippines, certain areas in Indonesia. But as you can see, most of the rest of Southeast Asia is not that great for wind. So that kind of takes out a kind of like a big decarbonization lever for Southeast Asia. The other one that has been talked about quite a lot is actually geothermal. So geothermal has been something that is potentially could be quite promising in places where there's a lot of volcanic activity, namely Indonesia as well as Philippines. But geothermal is also quite a challenging area because you drill down, if there's no water, then it's a bit of an issue. That's why the success rates can be quite limited in some of these countries. So Indonesia has been often cited as one that is a lot of geothermal resources, but they haven't been quite able to tap on that, partly because of this, and partly because the areas where you have geothermal activity usually are located far away from the demand, the populated areas. And that goes back to the whole renewable energy story. You need to connect places where you have the renewables to the places of demand, and usually they're not next door. Yeah. So the other issue that we face in Southeast Asia is the issue of coal plants. So there's been talk about phasing out coal plants. And in fact, there's been one successful example in the Philippines. So the Ayala Group, for instance, they have managed to work out an arrangement where they will, I think they will retire the plants at least 10 years early, if not more, depending on the conditions. Now, the problem for Southeast Asia in this particular case is that most of our coal plants are young compared with the rest of the world. So I'll just cite Indonesia as an illustration. Indonesia, I think in the early 2000s, basically embarked on 2 crash programs. Each, I mean, in total was 10 gigawatts each. So there was 20 gigawatts in total over the 2 programs. So they realized that they did not have enough electricity to meet their current needs. So they decided to basically ramp up supply quite significantly. And what they did was they actually worked a lot with Chinese companies. Chinese companies came in, offered a cost-effective solution for them. But a lot of that was also leveraging on Indonesia's coal deposits. So what they did was that they successfully managed to ramp it up to the point today whereby there's actually an oversupply of electricity in Indonesia's grid. But a lot of it is by young coal plants developed over the past 10, 15 years. So that accounts for the very young age profile for coal plants in Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia, as we know, coal plants, as we know, they generate a lot of emissions. And in certain places, if for older plants, the pollutants also, they're not great for the communities, the health of the communities surrounding it. But in essence, for Southeast Asia, one big challenge of basically replacing coal plants with renewables is that if you want to phase out the coal plants, you need to make it, you need to reach some form of a commercial arrangement with the current debt and equity holders of these coal plants. So the younger they are, you have a longer runway that you have to think about in terms of closing that gap, which makes it commercially a bit more tricky. So the Ayala example in the Philippines was great. But generally, I think across Southeast Asia, one big issue is the young age of the coal plants. So there's been a lot of talk about, JETP, the Just Energy Transition Program. I think 20 billion was committed to Indonesia. I think 8 billion was committed to Vietnam. But I think one big issue being faced with this particular challenge is the coal plants are simply a bit too young. The other thing that we could actually help the situation in Southeast Asia is actually doing what they do in Europe. So in Europe, they are actually forming interconnections between the different countries. So for instance, in the North Sea off the coast of Germany, if suddenly one day there's not enough wind, but the sun is shining in Spain, they could, through these interconnections, balance out the demand and supply. So right now, I think there are talks in amongst the various Southeast Asian countries to link the different countries all together. Now, one big challenge being faced by this is that even within the individual Southeast Asian countries, the transmission connection between some of these key areas is not quite there yet. Yeah, just again going back to Indonesia, for instance. So Indonesia, Java is the main center of economic activity. About 60% of the economy is located on Java. So is the population. But in terms of connectivity with the other islands, if not mistaken, they don't even have connection with Sumatra at this point in time. And Sumatra is this big island just next door to the north of it. So from Indonesia's perspective, their view is, look, I don't even have connectivity across my main islands. Then there's this talk about connecting across different countries. So for some of these countries, they will have to think about their domestic needs first. But connecting between the different islands in terms of transmission isn't the most cheap and easy thing to do. So they have to figure some of these things out. But notwithstanding that, there are some connections being formed. So again, coming back to Indonesia, there is actually a connection between West Kalimantan and Sarawak, where excess electricity, I believe is hydro, from West Kalimantan is being delivered to Sarawak. Or the other way around, can't remember. I think it's the other way around. Sarawak to West Kalimantan, forgive me. So there are certain things being formed together, but it's compared with what's happening in Europe, it's still a bit away. But having an interconnected grid could potentially help ASEAN to the fact that it could help balance out again the demand and supply as what we've seen in Europe, because not all countries in Southeast Asia, as we saw from the slide on the wind, have the same access to renewable energy. But the individual countries would have their own needs in terms of the transmission connections. The other thing is that there's going to be an increasing need of renewables domestically. So because of the carbon border adjustment mechanism being imposed by the Europeans, increasingly manufacturers that export to Europe, these 2 years, this year and next year, they have to start measure their exposure. Then starting from 2026, they have to start paying the European carbon tax in order to get access to European markets. So that has led to some of the manufacturers, be it domestic or international, located in the Southeast Asian countries to think about, look, I need access to renewable energy. Challenge is, as mentioned earlier, the grid is still dominated by fossil fuels. So some of these countries are actually ramping up their renewable energy capacity to meet their own domestic needs, because increasingly over the next couple of years, it's going to become a competitive issue. Some people have raised the fact that, look, CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is anti-competitive. And I think there's some talk about bringing it to the WTO and whatnot. But other countries are thinking about copying what the Europeans have done. And the Europeans are just starting with a few sectors that are covered by CBAM. Eventually, that coverage is going to expand. Coupled with other countries jumping on a bandwagon, is increasingly unescapable fact for manufacturers around the world. They have to deal with this. Right now, the immediate impact is on the high emitting sectors, steel, cement, so on and so forth. But increasingly, that will expand slowly, but surely. Now, I mentioned about CBAM. Actually, within Asia, I think we know that we don't exist on an island, obviously. We do business with the rest of the world. We sell to the rest of the world, the rest of us sell to us. And we can't run away from the fact that what happens in other countries have an impact on Asia. So this illustrates just some of the alphabet soup of initiatives that have an impact on Asia when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to trade. So the first one that is probably a bit more immediate, as mentioned, is CBAM on the top. The other one is actually probably even more immediate, is the European regulation on deforestation. So that places an onus on producers of products like palm oil, rubber, coffee, cocoa to basically trace their supply chain. So as the friends from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and would know, supply chain for some of these commodities is not the easiest thing to trace completely. So most companies, FMCGs, agriculture companies, they've traced their supply chains maybe up to 85, 95%. But the last 5 to 10% is a bit of a kicker, because that's usually the hardest to trace, because there's a smallholder guy sitting at the end of it. And there's a few multiple of layers of traders sitting between that guy and the formal supply chain. And that is the landscape in Southeast Asia in particular, because most farmers are fragmented. Some of it is dominated by big guys. In the case of palm oil, say around 60% of the acreage, again going back to Indonesia, is planted by the big guys. But they get a bit of their supply, actually a significant percentage of the supply from the remaining 40% from smallholders of all shapes and sizes. But usually each smallholder is below 2 hectares in terms of acreage. To certain degrees, that applies to other commodities like rubber as well. Coffee and cocoa is probably even more challenging to a certain extent, because coffee and cocoa, by the nature of their crops, they are not suited for large plantations. They're actually more suited for smaller holdings. Reason being is that if disease starts to spread, it spreads like wildfire. So the nature of that kind of like leads to smaller holdings or basically small holders playing a more significant role. Now, the Europeans know that this is an issue. I think the Europeans are engaging countries like Indonesia, Malaysia to basically build up capacity. But obviously, there'll be quarters within these countries saying that, look, this is discriminatory. So I think the intent is there, I think, by the Europeans, but they have to work with all these supplier countries to try to figure out how to get to where all wants to go. Because if you can actually pull this off, you can actually improve the productivity and the livelihood of the smallholders. But the first challenge for some of these things is you need to find out who the smallholder is, because the smallholder is quite far off. I visited some of these smallholders myself. Not the easiest thing to do. You have to travel hours on end, talk to a guy staying in a shed. His primary concern is not the EU. His primary concern is, can I get money for my next harvest? Where do I get the money to buy my next batch of fertilizers? Do I have enough money for petrol for my bike? It's as simple as that. Now, the bottom side is more probably, there's the Americans in the middle with the Just Energy Transition Partnership that I mentioned earlier about phasing out coal. Then to the left and to the right, Belt and Road, I think we're all aware. The Chinese, I think they are pushing for it, and increasingly there's a sustainability angle to that. And then the one that is probably a bit less high profile is the one by the Japanese on the right-hand side. They're thinking about green hydrogen. So Japan and Singapore are in a fairly similar position. We don't have that many levers to decarbonize. Yeah, ever since Fukushima, I think they kind of ruled out nuclear, although they may restart one or two of the plants. But they know that long term, they also need access to renewables. Now, the question is, how do they bring in the renewables? And they're also banking on things like green hydrogen, just like us, just like the Koreans. So they have basically set up this AZEC, basically to build up capacity and to promote funding. So all these things to various degrees affect what we do in Southeast Asia, in India, and in North Asia. It goes both ways. I mean, some of these are originated from South Asia. But to illustrate some of the trends here. So this basically shows, again, it's a two-way street. So China is actually one of the biggest investors in sustainability in Southeast Asia. So as mentioned earlier, China was also one of the biggest players for Indonesian coal plants. But they also, obviously, just like any other company, any other country, they see sustainability as a big, significant opportunity. So it could be EVs, it could be renewable energy. They are making inroads because they know that this is, Southeast Asia is where the market is. And they have actually, again, just apologize if I keep citing Indonesia, because that's something that is I'm covering quite a bit in my current job, and I covered a lot in my previous job. But just going back to Indonesia again, nickel, which I'll mention in my subsequent slide. The Chinese players know that Indonesia has a competitive advantage for nickel, and they have made significant investments in nickel so that you can supply to not just the Chinese EV manufacturers, but also Americans, also Europeans. So nickel is one example, but it extends to various other sectors, which kind of explains why this particular slide here, where Southeast Asia is number one in terms of outbound investments from China. And not all of these are state-owned enterprises. Quite a few of them are private-owned enterprises, as in the case of nickel. Now, the challenge with climate is that, generally speaking, there could be trade-offs. Yeah. So this, again, is about nickel mines in Indonesia. So I think there's been some, mixed coverage, especially from international media, about the impact on nature, on the impact of communities. So this on the left is from the Financial Times. On the right is a smaller publication. But again, in the past few days, Bloomberg came up with a very extensive article about nickel in Indonesia, more of the environmental impact. But he also highlighted the fact that nickel produced in Indonesia, I think it's about a third compared with nickel produced elsewhere. So there is an inherent cost competitive advantage. And the thing is that all of these will end up in EVs, which would help drive down emissions from vehicles. But I think the challenge for the Chinese companies and the US and European car manufacturers that take the nickel from these sources is, how do you achieve a balance? How do you make sure that things are done delicately? How you make sure that the communities benefit and not suffer from some of these investments? I think that's the challenge that I think the Chinese companies, the European buyers, in this case, the Indonesian government, it could be Philippines as well. They need to figure things out because it can't be as business as usual. Yeah, in the past, mining, you just dig the stuff out, squeeze the cost. That's the extent of it. But I think going forward, the challenge for companies, be it those digging the stuff out of the ground or the ones buying it, is how do you change that narrative? You can't do this, because guys like FT, guys like Bloomberg, they'll shine a spotlight on you. And the guy who's buying the vehicle at the end, the Tesla buyer, he sees this and say, look, where is the nickel coming from? Yeah, increasingly. And once I think they aggregate enough voices, people have to start to change. Now, the fly in the ointment in this particular case is that Indonesia is 1/3 the cost. So how do you make sure that you balance out all these different considerations? And now the most latest thing is that trade barriers against EVs made in China, which, if you think about it, I think hopefully a settlement can be reached, say, between the Chinese and the Europeans or the Chinese and the Canadians. Because at the end of the day, I think EVs does help regardless of where they are. And the manufacturers in China, they have really built up their knowledge, their product. It is a good quality quality car. You just go around Singapore, you see BYDs all over the place. And Singaporeans buy BYD because they're good and they're cost competitive. So there's a reason for that. Could there be some subsidies? Possibly. But, end of the day, from a climate perspective, it helps. But I obviously the world isn't so straightforward. Yes.
I think like in Indonesian government already banned the export of nickel because of the climate.
Nickel ore.
Oh yeah, nickel ore.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like Chinese manufacturers, they are pretty smart.
Yeah.
They already established many like manufacturers.
Yes.
Just inside, because I already talked to one manufacturer.
Yes.
Who made who built a factory in Indonesia. So
Yes.
just directly put their like industrial chain there.
Yes.
And instead, they're actually like importing nickel from Philippines. Like over 90% of the nickel ore.
Yes.
They're actually from Philippines. So I
Yes.
just want to add one more.
Indeed. I think the Indonesians have realized that in order to move up the value chain, I mean, the Indonesians are quite worried about being caught in the middle income trap. And rightfully so. They see other countries, they say, oh, I mean, I don't want to be stuck on the lower end of things. I want to move up the value chain. And this is why they have actually banned not just nickel, I think copper as well, different minerals. Exactly. But I think that the challenge for, again, the Indonesian government, the companies that invest in this, the company that buy from this, is how do you do this in a more sensitive, more sustainable way? And I think that the companies are aware. But fundamentally, some of these practices, they cost money. And the question is, how much do you pass on to the end consumer, be it in Europe or in Asia? Yeah. So look, I mean, it's not straightforward. Yeah. But I think the companies are increasingly aware that, look, their customers are asking questions, the regulators are asking questions, the newspapers are asking questions. But we need to, basically work together, because, the resources are there. Question is, how do we manage them effectively? Yeah. So actually, that's my last slide. Nickel is a good case study. They're both positive sides of it, and obviously negative impacts as well. Yeah. So it's not okay. Everything you do with EVs are good. Everything you do with EVs are bad. Same goes for nickel. Same goes for renewables. It's not so easy to pivot, especially for Asia, as we have seen from zero to hero overnight. You look at India as a case study. The amount of solar capacity and wind capacity in India is astounding. But on the flip side, they're also putting a lot of coal-fired capacity in there as well. Same goes for China. Yeah, because they need the security. We talk about in renewable energy circles, we talk about the trilemma. It has to be secure, it has to be cheap, it has to be renewable. It hardly ever exists. But this is the holy grail that the industry is working towards. And Asia is going to play a major role in that. Going back to green hydrogen, the key to unlocking that is what we call electrolyzers. Basically, that's the thing that will split the H2O into H2 and oxygen. Most of that is manufactured in China for good reason. So Asia has to be part of it, but we just have to be a bit more sensitive about things. Yeah, because we don't want to, just like squeezing a balloon, squeeze one end, solve the climate problem, and then create other things, biodiversity, community problems. Then it kind of defeats the purpose. Our firm's view is, in order to tackle climate, you need to address nature. It's not one or the other. Because if you do one or the other, it's kind of counterproductive. It won't be sustainable in the long run.
Raisa Robles from South China Morning Post and Al Jazeera Business Online. I just did an article actually on the energy crisis in the Philippines. And one of my sources told me that the reason why the Philippines is going so much into renewables is that the EU is about to impose a requirement that manufacturing has to, a certain percentage of the energy used in manufacturing export goods has to come from renewables. Have you heard that? And what's the prognosis on that?
So it probably is talking about the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the impact is not immediate. So the Europeans have told all the people who are exporting to Europe within those key sectors. So it's not everyone, not every sector. So some of the high emitting sectors, cement, steel, the usual suspects, that they have to start measuring their footprint this year and next year. Then after that, if you want to export to Europe, you have to pay basically the prevailing European tax. Yeah. So the Europeans are quite mindful about this. They say that if Philippines were to impose a same level of tax, then you don't have to pay to the Europeans. So if the Philippines were to introduce what we call carbon pricing, carbon tax, for instance, at the same level, and the level of coverage is the same, that means it covers the same sectors, actually Philippine manufacturers may not be subject to the European carbon tax. Yeah. So the Europeans, the ultimate goal, some people say again it's discriminatory, so on and so forth, but I think the Europeans, they're doing it for two reasons. One obviously is climate. The other thing is that they are aware that their own sectors, all these high emitting sectors, are at a disadvantage. So they want to level the playing field. But they also, like I said, gave the provision that if the individual country can impose that tax, by all means, you don't have to pay to me. You can pay to your own government. And then hopefully the government can use it for climate ends and whatnot. So again, I think the intent is there. So I think if capacity can be raised, if investments can flow to the right areas in these countries, then who knows? I think then the intent of this policy may be well served. Yeah, but in the meantime, a bit of work needs to be done in terms of measuring your footprint and trying to figure out how can you reduce your emissions.
Thank you. So I'm Nitin Koka. I'm a freelance journalist based in Japan, and I cover climate and energy quite a bit. And one thing I want to ask about is kind of carbon pricing. So I guess one thing I've been told quite often in Asia is that low carbon pricing kind of makes a lot of investments in renewables challenging, but also kind of prevents fossil fuel pricing or kind of maintains the space of fossil fuels in the region. So I'm wondering if your thoughts about, do we need regional carbon pricing in Asia, and would that help? What kind of impact that would have for energy transition?
I think regional carbon pricing, I mean, it depends on what it's about. Is it Asia-wide or is it just Southeast Asia? Maybe the easiest one is Southeast Asia, ASEAN, because there's a bit of a mechanism there already. Beyond that, I mean, getting, the other large countries, the larger the country, the more difficult it is. To agree on most things is probably a bit more challenging. But even then, I think carbon pricing, the Europeans can manage to pull it off. But there are structures, there are institutions that are a bit more further along, and I think a different shape than what we have in ASEAN. So I doesn't seem to be on the cards at this point in time. They're talking more about more fundamental things like, this, grid connectivity. I think the other thing, as mentioned earlier, the some of the key challenges with developing renewables is sometimes the wind is not there. I may be sitting on the ring of fire, but I drill a hole, but there may not be any water inside for me to generate the steam that generates electricity. So this is where actually countries like Japan, New Zealand has actually signed an agreement with Indonesia to help them improve the success rate for geothermal energy. So these are some of the inherent factors. The other inherent factor is actually how, when you generate the thing, how do you sell to the grid? So therein lies some challenges. Indonesia, you have a monopoly. You have to sell to this thing called PLN, which is the state electricity grid. So you have to deal with them. I think in Philippines, I think there's a bit more private sectors involved. So there is a bit of to be a renewable energy developer in Asia, there's a bit of few hoops that you have to jump through. And it need not be related to carbon pricing or not. CBAM, I think, have started people thinking about things. But I think inherently, governments like Singapore, they know that they need to do it regardless. Yeah, they have set their goals as per the Paris Agreement. They need to figure things out. The challenge for, again, places like Japan and Singapore is that options are not there and not going to appear tomorrow. So green hydrogen, for instance, you want to develop something that's big and economical enough, you need probably best part of 10 years. You got to find a place, say maybe in Australia, figure out who's going to fund it, figure out who's going to do the off-taking, figure out who's going to finance it, and then get someone to run it and manage it on a 25, 30-year basis. So it's something that will take time. And actually the first milestone is 2030. This is when the first milestone for the Paris Agreement. Countries have to start, they say that they're going to commit, conditional or unconditional, to meet these targets. People will say, look, this is non-binding. The countries are not going to get penalized if they don't meet the targets. But the thing is that the targets are there for everyone to see. If you don't meet it, your voters are going to ask you, hey, how come you're not meeting the targets? Or other countries will ask, why are you? So there's a bit of pressure there to a certain extent. But coming back to the question of carbon pricing and renewables, it is a bit complicated. I think within Asia, they're looking a bit more at some of these issues that are hopefully easier to address, but by no means easy. Yeah.
I'm interested in what you think the view of nuclear energy is across Asia. Obviously, that's something that is center of the conversation elsewhere in the world. But in this region, is there much investment, or what's the sentiment towards it?
Are you from Australia?
I am.
Oh, okay.
It's very chaotic there, the conversation.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But look, even the Saudis, I think, are thinking about nuclear energy. I mean, that's what they're telling the Americans about. So people are looking 20, 30 years down the road because, look, nuclear energy in whatever shape or form, it could be current technology, it could be fusion. Again, it's not going to appear overnight. Even Singapore is thinking about nuclear. So, but they know that, look, they're not going to build a nuclear plant like just there. Yeah. But what they're doing is that they're building up the human capacity to understand what are the issues and challenges. They're tracking technologies. Even my previous company has invested into some of these just to understand what is taking place. Philippines is another example. Philippines had this plant that was built by Westinghouse, right? Yeah, been mothballed since, yeah. But now there's even talk about getting the Americans to help them restart the thing. Japan, Fukushima, unfortunate, but even then they realized that, look, we need to square the circle. They may have to think about it. But I think, look, I think everyone understand or is aware that nuclear energy, in terms of emissions, fantastic. But you have to look at the whole life cycle cost. Yeah, because what do you then do with the waste? Fusion, I think, is some ways away. But I think for countries looking at this, even Indonesia is thinking about a nuclear plant. They're banking on a new technology called molten salt, which I think reduces the issues of meltdowns, or the chances of meltdown. So we don't know yet whether what countries will pull the trigger at what time. But I think what we do see is even Singapore is thinking about, okay, we know that this is not going to be a fire issue. we're gonna do something about it now to understand if we need to pull the trigger 5-10 years down the road, we're in a better position to do so. I think countries like Vietnam further down the road. Yeah, Thailand, I don't really think so. Malaysia, there's no plans yet. But end of the day, there are advantages, but countries and companies have to look at it from a whole life cycle basis. Compare what we call the levelized cost of energy between nuclear and alternatives. So at the end of the day, it's still a commercial decision, but we are seeing signs within Asia or people starting thinking about it. Yeah, because again, for energy transition in Southeast Asia or in Asia in general, it has to be a portfolio of solutions. It cannot be just one. If you're just holding yourself hostage to one solution, I think then it gets a bit more tricky lah. So and again, some of these solutions are not going to happen overnight. Fusion, in our case, even renewables is again, we can't build it tomorrow in Australia and pipe it over to Singapore. It's a multi-decade effort. But Singapore is starting. Some of the other countries are starting. And I think so long as people go in with their eyes open, the people go in, supporting it, trade-offs, whatever, I think that is probably the a good outcome to achieve.
Thank you. Bonnie from the Standard Hong Kong. Actually, I've got several questions. Okay, so first of all, green hydrogen. So the high price, is it also one of the hindrance for the development? And then also at the same time, as you said, China, they have been making a lot of electrolysis. And then also, for example, in Xinjiang, they have been, producing a lot of green hydrogen already. So I'm not sure if that would be something like similar to solar panels in the past. It was they were very expensive, and then now that people has been accusing China, they have over capacity. I'm not sure whether this will also happen for green hydrogen. So that's my first question, and then my second question is I understand that. Singapore has been thinking of, looking at green hydrogen from an economic perspective. Okay, so what is the role that Singapore can play? Is it like the pricing of hydrogen? Yeah, and also my third question is, we've been talking about a lot of, the use of nickels and coppers and things like that. But then at the same time, know that Hong Kong and Singapore, there have been quite a lot of, green finance, supporting the energy transition, or also supporting projects in Southeast Asia. So to what extent can they really help? And also, I would like to know more about, the technology, about recycling. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I'll address one by one. Just remind me in case I forget. So green hydrogen. So my company is actually developing a large green hydrogen / ammonia project in Western Australia. So total estimate, we call it the East Kimberley project. The one major difference between this project and some of the other projects in Australia is that we are minority shareholder. The majority are actually the First Nations groups. So there's it's called the Aboriginal Clean Energy Partnership. So we own a 25% stake. 3 different First Nation groups hold the 25, 25, 25. So the 75%. The idea is to basically generate a significant amount of hydrogen, which are converted into green ammonia, which will then export and basically also part of it for Australia's own needs lah. Electrolyzers is one of the key issues. The other thing is obviously in order to generate the green hydrogen, you need a significant amount of renewable energy. It could be hydro, it could be solar. So different people are leveraging on different things. The cost of PV panels have actually come down, I think, recently. If you haven't read it, The Economist did a very large piece on solar energy just recently this week. There's quite a few interesting tidbits in there. But I think the other thing is actually electrolyzers. I think that there is a significant cost of that. In Southeast Asia, I think if you need to do a lot of solar, you need a lot of land. So you need to either acquire it or get hold of land in one way or the other. And sometimes in Southeast Asia, acquiring land is not the most straightforward of things. Land titles, for instance, sometimes not 100% clear, so on and so forth. So cost is one thing. Permits, getting the necessary approvals, all that is another thing. Fundamentally, ideally, what you like is some form of offtake. Then that makes it a bit more bankable. Then, because at the end of the day, you need some form of debt financing to basically finance these projects. And that goes to, I mean, what role can Singapore play in the role of green finance? I think what Singapore has done, or Singapore companies have been doing, is basically, again, they're projecting forward. So for some of the more recent tenders for power plants, they have said this has to be coal-fired. That means between fossil fuel, natural gas, presumably, and hydrogen. So it has to be able to switch between one or the other. So that is, the companies are basically positioning the plants in Singapore for that, to be able to take on green hydrogen. The other thing that Singapore can do is, obviously, we are a hub for legal services, for finance, for consultancy, engineering consultancy, for instance. So these are things that we actually can help to enable supply in neighboring countries, working with local partners. So the demand is there, hopefully generate a bit, but obviously not by ourselves. I think the Japanese, for instance, the Koreans are also thinking about this. So we can always come together and form a consortium, offtake, finance, whatever. Green finance, I think, is something that both Singapore and Hong Kong are thinking a lot about. The banks, actually, our sense is that they want to do more. I think the question is whether can you make it bankable. And bankable, I think, like I mentioned earlier, is can you make sure that there's offtake there, at what price, so on and so forth, and hopefully the cost can be manageable as there. Because at the end of the day, the banks will look at you. Yes, I want to promote and support sustainability, but at the end of the day, I still have to put this before my credit committee to make sure that it is commercially viable and feasible. Because at the end of the day, it's still a loan or it's still a debt. So it has to make a bit of commercial sense. And then in terms of the last point is about circularity, right?
I think that China. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay. China, they have been making a lot of batteries. Okay. For energy saving. So after all, especially green. You can really count on green energy, solar, wind. Okay, so the best way is using technology in terms of battery R&D development. Yeah. So energy saving and also and also recycling. Yes.
So
yeah, in this part of the world.
So batteries, yes, definitely. I think it will play a significant role. Just again coming back to Singapore, a company called Sembcorp in Singapore actually has, if not mistaken, a 250 megawatt battery on Jurong Island, somewhere that direction. So again, it's to position, apart from the coal-fired power plants, the batteries need to be there to, again, because of the intimacy nature of renewables. It's not always sunny and all that, so you need that in between. I think what the Chinese have thinking about is using sodium instead of nickel. And that hopefully can drive down the cost, specifically for these large industrial scale batteries. Because if everything is nickel, the cost is probably gonna be not ideal. So if the sodium, I think that's what the Chinese are leading, if that can come in. Because fundamentally, the grid connection helps. Having more renewable energy locations helps. But fundamentally, it's not going to be sunny all the time. So we do need batteries of various shapes and sizes, either at the grid level or the individual, maybe even at the individual level, to help supplement that. And if sodium can play a part in this, especially for the larger batteries, that could be, I think some people have mentioned that this could be a potential game changer.
Hi, thanks for your sharing. I'm from Taiwan with the Commonwealth magazine. So I'm wondering, could you shed some light on the carbon market and who will be the key role in this region and what's the general sentiment in Southeast Asia toward the carbon market? Thanks.
So carbon markets, yeah, I'm a bit more familiar with that. Carbon markets, I think within Southeast Asia, you have a few projects that popped up over the years, and some of them are actually fairly good projects. Indonesia is probably a good example, lah. The world's largest carbon project by volume, a project called Katingan, Central Kalimantan, which is that big island in the middle. This one. So literally is somewhere here, lah. So this is actually the interesting thing about this project is on 150,000 hectares of peat. So peat, I'm not sure whether how familiar you are. Peat is actually is very good for storing carbon because they absorb a lot of carbon compared with normal what we call mineral soils, lah. So this particular project developer, they came across a forestry concession. They said, okay, it's being zoned for logging. So they went to the government. This was 2010, I believe, or the late 2000s, and said, why don't you, instead of cutting down the trees, we turn this into a carbon project? They were met with physical looks, what is carbon, so on and so forth. But they managed to persevere, and then the result today is a carbon project about twice the size of Singapore, deep peat, which generates between 5 to 6 million tons of avoided carbon a year. So in terms of volume, it's one of the largest projects. And the key to their success is actually, we call this in the market nature-based solutions because it's using nature to solve climate. My personal view is that it's a bit of a misnomer because the key to their success is actually people. Because they have a string of communities surrounding that concession. And then what they have done in terms of success is they went to each and individual village and said, look, we're going to do this carbon project. Again, the question is, what is carbon? I'm in the middle of nowhere. I just want to have enough food to put on my table. But they managed to do that over a period of time. Thought about alternative livelihoods for them. And then I then came up with a good example of what a nature-based solutions should be. I visited them twice, so I know the developers fairly well. So in terms of carbon markets, places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand as well. I mean, this could, and Vietnam, as well as Laos. They could be areas where it's an alternative way of monetizing nature. The traditional way is extractive, it's monoculture. So this is a different way of basically, end of the day, you have to make sure that the livelihoods are protected. And in fact, if you can even increase their livelihoods. So this is a different way of doing business with nature versus what we have done in the past. Again, it's just like the nickel story. Nickel story in the past is find a piece of land. The way I measure performance, my cost, the price is given in the market, basically squeeze up as much as I can out of the place. This is a different way of doing business. It's a lot more difficult. But in certain cases, you can actually make a difference as this particular project has done. Peat is quite important to climate because if you degrade it, basically what they do is they drain it, make it dry, and then convert that to plantations. The problem with that is that when it's dry, it becomes a bit of a powder cake for fires. This is why you see fires in Southeast Asia, in the southern part, every so often. But thanks to the efforts of the Indonesian government, that has basically reduced quite considerably. But the fundamental issue is that this thing called peat, if you can manage peat well, and in the case of this particular project, if you can turn it into a viable project, actually it does have benefits for the climate, benefits for biodiversity, as well as benefits for the people. So that is one example. I think generally speaking, governments in ASEAN have know about the potential. Singapore, obviously, we don't have any locations, peat, forests. Well, we do, but we can't turn them into carbon projects. But the long and short of it is, just like renewable energy, there's a bit of demand from companies based here, as well as from the Singapore government. Singapore government has been actually signing a lot of what we call Article 6 MOUs, trying to see whether we could promote and develop these kind of projects in other countries. And in exchange for basically bringing some of these claims back to Singapore so that we can claim against our NDCs. So it is a new area. There's been a bit of history. There's both supply and demand side played by the different Southeast Asian countries. But it will take some time to settle down. More broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of controversies, and some of them rightly so about carbon markets. But I think increasingly people realize that in order to meet the climate goals, you do need some form of high quality credits. The American government, I think 2 weeks ago, came out with a statement and said, look, we recognize the role played by carbon credits, but it has to be high quality, high integrity, so on and so forth. So I think that's where what we as a company and others in the industry are aiming for, is this kind of high quality credits. Yeah.
Just checking if there are any other questions from the fellows, because if not, I actually have one. And that actually follows on
Hope
from
it's an easy one.
what you were just talking about. So in contrast to Indonesia, in Malaysia, Tasik Chini is also a peat swamp, 90,000 hectares.
Sorry, which location is this?
Tasik Chini, it's just outside Pahang. It's,
okay.
Yes, exactly. And that's what my question is about, because that one, pricing was an issue. And one of the issues is that that the forwards are a bit of a novelty in this market, and Singapore has a role as a price setter, but pricing was a stumbling block in that issue.
Yeah.
So how is that as a bottleneck in this market, in this region?
Yeah, I think yes, pricing, carbon is not like other commodities, say metals or fuels and whatnot, where you have a price curve, you can kind of like project out, try to play around with it, so on and so forth, and come to a decision whether you invest or not. Carbon, I think, is still a bit nascent. But that being said, we do see tailwinds. So end of the day, people are not decarbonizing fast enough. You look at major surveys done by Accenture, MSCI, so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that, and we see that the first milestone is 2030. So we anticipate supply, and supply is constrained right now because of these very questions. But we know that demand is going to hit at some point. Now, what does that mean for investors? Investors, I think, have to be prepared that, look, it's not going to be a straight line up. You have to be prepared for a bit of volatility. But I think the fundamental thing you want to do is to make sure it's a high quality project. High quality means a couple of things. One is from a technical perspective. So carbon technical regulations or standards are a bit complicated, to say the least. But you have to err on the side of conservatism. So a lot of the paper that has appeared, a lot of the negative reports that have appeared in the likes of, say, The Guardian and so on and so forth, there's one or two main themes. One is that you are issuing way too many credits. Yeah. The other thing is that, the people are none the wiser. This thing about carbon colonialism and so on and so forth. So the first starting point is you have to make sure it's a good quality project. Because if there's good quality project, the likelihood is that the demand will be there. At what price? Don't know. But at least you tick one box and get it out of the way. So quality in terms of technical, quality in terms of making sure, just like the project in Indonesia, communities have to be first and foremost. So for extractive companies, the way they approach usually a piece of land is, again, let me try to squeeze as much as I can. But here you got to flip it up the other way around. So extractive companies, sometimes they have to figure out, okay, I have to change, but I don't know how to change it. Sometimes our companies advise them on, you got to basically turn it upside down. So, and also biodiversity, obviously, because there are things what we call afforestation, reforestation projects. The best way to generate carbon, find the best, fastest growing tree and plant it over the place. But these may not be native species. And reforestation or revegetation is not easy. It's not just planting a seed in the ground and hope for the best. There is a bit of science to it. So you got to make sure that you got to be conservative about your carbon projections. You got to make sure that all the technical issues are done, dusted. So you make sure that the quality is done as much as you can. Now, on the demand side, it's not completely, there are certain things you can do. So for just to cite an example, in terms of off-takers, we are seeing different companies. They're industrial companies, energy companies, airlines. The one thing that's kind of interesting of late is actually the technology companies. So the likes of Amazon, Google, Salesforce, Apple. So what they have done previously is that, again, in the case of Apple, they have actually projected out to 2030, I'm going to need X amount of credits. So instead of waiting for developers to come to them with all sorts of, different kind of credits, they decided to park their money with the joint venture that we had with HSBC, 200 million, and say, look, we give you the criteria, help us look for good quality credits. Yeah. But if you're a developer, you're an investor, I know the tech companies are interested in nature. They used to be only interested in tech, but they realized that tech can only bring you so far and it's quite expensive. So they need to complement, they need to build a portfolio. So they have already set out some key criteria. And you can engage these companies, look, does this meet your mark? If not, what do you need to do? Yeah. And then hopefully get some form of commitment, not a slam dunk, but engaging some of these buyers beforehand, trying to figure things out. But this is not, like I said, it's not like a commodity, not a metal, it's, you can go in, there's a bit more factors, a bit more transparency. There's a bit more understanding that you need to develop either in-house or working with people like us that we can help along the way. Yeah, so these are, in essence, it's quite a complicated thing, but it's basically this is the situation facing the industry at the moment.
I'm not trying to rush you at all. You have gone over time, but because there have been so many wonderful questions, I do want to give everyone the opportunity to, if you're not leaving right away,
Hold on, what time is it?
It is 2:05.
Oh, okay, I got a bit of time.
Okay. All right.
If
Well,
there's any-
let's give Heng Dean Law a hand, please.